Okay, so this video is an introduction to period 2, the classical era, which begins around 600 BCE and ends in 600 CE. Before we get into the classical era, let's start with a quick review of period 1. In 200,000 BCE, we see humans evolving on the continent of Africa. They eventually are going to migrate or spread out across all of the rest of the continents. During the Paleolithic era, everyone was living as hunter-gatherers. Then around 10,000 BCE, we see in various regions around the world, people begin settling down as a result of the agricultural revolution. They domesticate various plants and animals. They form sedentary farming villages. Eventually, over time, those villages grow more complex, more dense, which leads to the formation of various civilizations. The civilizations that we discussed at length in the video formed around river valleys, for example, Mesopotamia in the Middle East, ancient Egypt, the Indus River Valley in South Asia, and ancient China, the Shang and Zhou dynasties in East Asia. We also haven't talked about it yet, but we'll eventually talk about in the Americas, the Olmec and the Shavian, and then the formation of two major religions during this period, Hinduism and Judaism. So the foundations period represents only about 5% of the AP test. So moving forward, the era that we're now entering is known as the classical era. And that word classical suggests that this is an era that people in various regions around the world look back fondly upon because we see the formation of some major empires like the Persian Achaemenid Empire, the ancient Greek city-states like Sparta and Athens, the Roman Empire, the Qin and Han dynasties in China. And then in the Americas, we'll talk about the Mayan civilization. We also see the formation of two major religions, Buddhism and Christianity during this period. So period 2 represents about 15% of the AP test. Now, the big questions that we need to be able to answer after watching this video are first, what is an empire? And then second, what are the major characteristics of the classical era that define this era and make it different from the era that we studied before? So what is an empire? An empire, for purposes of this class, is a large unified territory that's made up of diverse peoples that speak different languages, that practice different religions, and that is controlled by a single supreme central ruler. So you have one single person who has supreme authority for all of their society. So some famous empires in history, the Galactic Empire. Applying our definition, we can think about, is the Galactic Empire really an empire? So we'd have to ask, one, is it large? Well, according to Wikipedia, there are 69 million star systems that make up the Galactic Empire with 1.75 million planets. So I think, again, we can maybe question our source here, but we certainly can say that the Galactic Empire is large. Is it diverse? Yes, it's made up of Wookiees and Twi'leks and humans and Ewoks and Mon Calamari. Now, is it ruled by one single supreme central ruler? Yes, you have stormtroopers, Darth Vader, royal guards, but ultimately they are all answering to one single person in the Galactic Empire, Emperor Palpatine. So the Galactic Empire meets all three of our characteristics to qualify as an empire. Now, what about the United States? Is the United States today an empire? Is it large? I think it's, by any definition, it's certainly large, especially if you consider our military presence that exists around the world with all the various military bases that we have in existence around the world. Is it diverse? Absolutely. There's many religions practiced in the United States, many different languages that are spoken. Is it ruled by one single supreme central ruler? I think that's maybe where, if you're going to get a quibble about whether the United States is an empire or not, it'd probably be around that particular question. I would argue that if we had a supreme central ruler, it would probably be the Constitution, which has supreme authority in our country. So when we think about empires, there's always going to be a life cycle of an empire. They're initially going to rise as their military gets stronger and begins to control more and more territory. Eventually, they reach their peak, sometimes referred to as the golden age, where culture, innovation, technology are flourishing. But eventually, they're going to experience collapse and a fall for various reasons, which we'll discuss in a moment. Some common factors that lead to the collapse and fall of empires. So it sort of begs the question, if the United States is an empire, where are we on that lifespan? Kind of an interesting question to think about. Now, what are the major characteristics of the classical era? So, for one thing, we start to see the formation of empires. So, during the classical era, from 600 BCE to 600 CE, empires are going to grow, imposing political unity on diverse peoples. Now, let's take a quick little quiz to see how well you know your classical empires. I'm going to show you some different empires in terms of their geography, and you're going to match those to the list of empires that we have up here. So, letter A, what empire is that? It's the very first empire that really begins around 600 BCE and marks that major turning point from period 1 to period 2. That is the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Notice letter B, not an empire, instead just a small collection of city-states. So that is classical Greece, those Greek city-states like Sparta and Athens. Those city-states would eventually be conquered along with the Persian Empire by Empire C, which is Alexander's empire. Now, Alexander's empire is not going to last long after his death. It's going to split apart into various pieces. Eventually, in the Mediterranean basin, we're going to see the formation of a new empire, Empire D, which is the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire is going to be connected via long-distance trade to an empire on the other side of Eurasia, and that's Han China, the Han Dynasty in China. And then in India, South Asia, we're going to see the formation of the Mauryan Empire and also later the Gupta Empire.
I was building an empire.
So if you were building an empire, one of the major questions that we need to be able to answer as we start thinking about the classical era is, what steps would you take to create unity over such a large area with diverse people? It's one thing to build up your military and to go out and conquer various regions, but ultimately that's not going to last very long unless you put into place, things that can bring people together, that sort of act as a unifying force. So I want us to be thinking about this question. What steps could you take to ultimately bring people together and unify an empire where you have people that speak different languages, that practice different religions? So by 600 CE, all of the classical empires that had once existed had fallen. So the classical Greeks and the Persians were conquered by Alexander's empire. The Mauryan Empire and Han China, the Roman Empire, are all going to collapse. So what are some common reasons for imperial collapse? In this class, we're going to really sort of categorize them into two main categories, which are the internal and external factors. So let's start with some internal factors. One, as you see empires grow over time, eventually they just become unmanageable. Here we see the sort of spread of the Roman Empire. Did you notice what happens? Eventually the empire split apart into two pieces because it just became overextended is oftentimes the word, or there was imperial overreach, where you expand your boundaries so far that it's just difficult to manage. Now, another common factor in the collapse of empires has to do with the environment, the exploitation of various resources. So, for example, in the Roman Empire, they cut down a lot of timber. Well, if you don't replant trees, eventually you're going to run out of wood. And so that became a big issue, the overexploitation of resources. Can you think in the context of our modern age, the United States, are there any resources that we might be overexploiting today that might cause us to have some concerns for our fall and collapse? Certainly oil, but I would actually argue maybe water is one that we should be even more concerned about. Another common factor that leads to an imperial collapse is class divisions, this gap between the rich and the poor. As time passes, oftentimes we see the wealthy grow wealthier, the poor grow poorer in empires. And so maybe that's another question you could think about in the United States. Is that a factor or challenge that might lead to our eventual fall and collapse as well? These class divisions. Now, the thing about class divisions is eventually people that are poor are hungry. And when people are poor and hungry, that means they're going to engage in rebellions, internal rebellions, uprisings. So we'll be studying a few of those in the context of Han China and in the context of the Roman Empire. Another common external factor as empires grow, that eventually leads to more trade. And which seems like a great thing, except for more trade also leads to the spread of diseases. So we have the spread of epidemic diseases. We'll talk about the way in which the plague is going to impact and lead to weakness in the Roman Empire and also Han China. So epidemic disease is another common factor that leads to the collapse of empires. But the sort of nail in all of these empires' coffins is usually external invasion. And the people who are usually doing the invading are coming on horses, are these pastoral nomadic groups who sort of look at these weakening empires and decide they want to sort of pick apart the carcass of the empire in order to gain from its previous wealth. So in the classical era, we're going to also talk about four major transregional trade networks that developed that result in the exchange of people, goods, culture, ideas, and technology and diseases. And these include the Mediterranean sea lanes. We'll talk about how the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans are all going to exploit this highway. Again, the Mediterranean Sea is not a barrier, geographic barrier. It serves as a highway connecting people across the Mediterranean Sea. That's why the people of North Africa are very similar to the people of Southern Europe. So we'll talk about the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, who all used the Mediterranean sea lanes. The second major transregional trade network is the Silk Road, which connected Han China in East Asia, South Asia, the Indians, the Middle East, and Europe and the Roman Empire. So we'll talk about the Silk Road during this classical age period. We'll talk about the formation of the Indian Ocean sea lanes, which is going to connect China with Southeast Asia, those islands in modern day Indonesia, India, the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, East Africa. Some various villages and cities are going to start to form in East Africa. So we'll talk more about the Indian Ocean sea lanes, which were driven by these knowledge of these monsoon winds in the Indian Ocean. We'll talk about the formation of the trans-Saharan trade networks across the Sahara Desert, which connected North Africa with West Africa. For instance, the Roman Empire with various peoples down in West Africa. So the major lasting legacy, though, maybe of the classical era is the formation and transformation of four major world religions. So during period 1, the foundations period, prior to 600 BCE, we had the formation of two major world religions, Judaism and Hinduism. Now in period 2, the classical age, starting around 600 BCE, we see the formation of two other world religions, Buddhism, founded by Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, and Christianity, founded by Jesus of Nazareth. So we'll spend a lot of time focusing on both the formation of Buddhism and Christianity in this period, but also the way in which older religions like Judaism and Hinduism were transformed. So the big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video is, what is an empire? What are those characteristics? And then what are the major characteristics of the classical era? As always, thanks for watching.